Your history teacher lied to you, not on purpose maybe, but by omission, which might be worse. When you think of World War II prisoner of war camps, you picture Nazi stalags. Maybe you've seen The Great Escape or Stalag 17. You know about the Geneva Convention violations, the meagre rations, the brutal guards. You know that approximately 1% of American POWs held in German camps died in captivity. 1%. Tragic, yes, but survivable. Now let me tell you what they didn't teach you in school. 40%. 40%. That's how many American prisoners of war died in Japanese captivity. Not 1 in 100, 4 in 10. Of the roughly 68,000 American servicemen captured by Japanese forces in the Pacific Theater, 27,000 never came home. 27,000 young men, your fathers, your uncles, your neighbours, died in conditions so horrific that survivors couldn't speak about them for decades. Some never spoke at all. They died on what became known as hell ships, unmarked cargo vessels where men were packed into holds so tight they couldn't sit down, where temperatures reached 120 degrees, where they drank their own urine to survive, where the dead remained standing because there was no room for them to fall. They died in work camps, where a bowl of weevil-infested rice was considered a good meal, where diseases you can't pronounce killed men who survived bullets and bombs, where saying "I'm an American" could get you beaten to death. This is their story, the one America tried to forget. On April 8, 1942, Army physician Jack Comstock wrote in his diary, "Nice day, air raids right after breakfast. Many, many patients all day. Few casualties, but mostly malnutrition, exhaustion, and nerves." It was the calm before a storm that would last 3.5 years. Comstock was stationed on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, where 76,000 American and Filipino forces had been holding out against Japanese invasion for 4 months. They called it the Battling Bastards of Bataan. No Mama, no Papa, no Uncle Sam. General Douglas MacArthur had already fled to Australia with his famous promise, "I shall return." But for the men he left behind, return seemed like a distant fantasy. The next day, April 9th, they were ordered to surrender. Comstock, like thousands of his fellow soldiers, had no idea that surrender would be worse than death. In the American military tradition, prisoners of war were supposed to be treated humanely. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established rules, basic human rights that even enemies were supposed to respect. American soldiers had been trained that if captured, they should give only their name, rank, and serial number. Then they'd wait out the war in a camp, playing cards, receiving Red Cross packages, maybe writing letters home. That's how it worked in Europe. That's what they expected. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese military operated under a different code entirely. In their warrior culture, surrender was the ultimate dishonour. A true soldier fought to the death or committed suicide before capture. The very concept of surrendering was so shameful that Japanese military doctrine barely acknowledged it could happen. To their thinking, any soldier who surrendered had forfeited his humanity. He deserved no respect, no mercy, no rights. When 76,000 men laid down their weapons on Bataan, the Japanese command was not prepared. They hadn't planned for prisoners because they didn't expect any. They had no food reserves, no transportation, no camps ready. What they did have was contempt. Absolute, seething contempt for men they considered cowards. And so began what history would remember as the Bataan Death March. But before we walk that road of tears, we need to understand who these men were. They weren't professional soldiers, most of them. They were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit. They were Filipino scouts who'd lived their entire lives in villages that suddenly became battlefields. The youngest was 17, lied about his age to join up after Pearl Harbor. The oldest was in his 50s, a National Guard officer who'd probably expected to spend his service time training recruits stateside. Jack Comstock was 28, fresh out of medical school, newly married. He'd volunteered for army service thinking he'd deliver babies at a stateside hospital. Instead, he found himself performing amputations by candlelight in a jungle hospital with 6,500 patients and nowhere near enough medicine, food, or help. In the months before surrender, he'd watched young men waste away. Malaria ravaged entire units. Dysentery turned soldiers into hollow-eyed ghosts. They were on quarter rations, sometimes less. The daily meal might be a handful of rice and whatever could be foraged from the jungle. Monkeys, when they could catch them. Mules, when the ammunition trucks didn't need them anymore. Anything. By April, men were too weak to patrol. Some couldn't even stand. The defence of Bataan had become a slow-motion catastrophe, a mathematical certainty counting down to defeat. Comstock watched his patients' conditions deteriorate day by day. Mostly malnutrition, exhaustion and nerves, he wrote with physician's precision, as if clinical language could make it less horrifying. These were 19 and 20-year-old men who should have been strong, vital, alive with youth. Instead, they were starving, sick, broken. When the order came to surrender, some of the men actually felt relief. The fighting would stop. They'd be prisoners, sure, but at least they'd be fed. At least the wounded would get proper medical care. At least they'd survive. 27,000 of them were wrong. The Japanese guards who arrived to take control couldn't believe what they were seeing. 76,000 prisoners. It was inconceivable. They'd been told the Americans were nearly defeated, yes, but surrender on this scale? It was beyond their comprehension, and it filled them with rage. Here's what you need to understand about the psychology of what happened next. The Japanese soldiers had been fighting for 4 months too. They'd lost friends and comrades. They'd endured hardships. They'd followed orders and maintained discipline and done everything their code demanded. And now, facing them, were tens of thousands of men who'd chosen the coward's way out. To the Japanese mind, these prisoners had no honour. They deserved no consideration. They were less than human. The senior Japanese commanders issued orders. The prisoners would march north to Camp O'Donnell, about 65 miles away. They would walk. There would be minimal food and water. Stragglers would be left behind. What those orders meant in practice was something else entirely. April in the Philippines is brutally hot. Temperatures regularly exceed 90 degrees, and the humidity makes every breath feel like drowning. The prisoners were already weakened by months of starvation and disease. Many were wounded. Some could barely stand. And they were told to walk 65 miles. No one told them when they'd get water. No one told them when they'd rest. The column of prisoners stretched for miles, a river of humanity shuffling north under the merciless sun, guarded by soldiers who'd been taught that these men were lower than dogs. Jack Comstock, the young doctor from California, joined that march. He carried what medical supplies he could, some sulphur powder, a few bandages, his morphine syringes nearly empty. He knew what lay ahead would require more medicine than existed in the entire Philippine Islands. He had no idea how right he was. As the sun climbed higher on that first day of the march, as men began to fall and the guards began to show just how little mercy they intended, the American prisoners of the Pacific War began to understand a terrible truth. They weren't going to a prison camp. They were walking into hell, and hell, as it turned out, was just the beginning. Private Paul Cascio would later remember the exact moment he understood he might not survive. It was the third day of the march. A man 10 feet ahead of him, Cascio never learned his name, collapsed. Just went down like someone had cut his strings. The column slowed, men trying to help him up, but the Japanese guards were already moving in. They didn't help. They didn't call for a medic. They pulled out their bayonets. I turned away before I saw it, Cascio would tell his nephew 60 years later. his voice still shaking. But I heard it. You never forget that sound. Never. The Bataan Death March has become a name, a historical event, something you might see in a documentary with somber music and old photographs. But when you're walking it, when you're the one stepping over bodies and pretending not to see the man beside you crying for water he'll never get, it's not history, it's an endless present tense of suffering. Men died of thirst within sight of artesian wells the guards wouldn't let them approach. Men died of heat stroke, their brains literally cooking inside their skulls. Men died of dysentery, unable to control their bowels, collapsing in their own waste. Men died of malaria, of exhaustion, of infections in wounds that hadn't healed properly. Men died because they fell and couldn't get up fast enough. Men died because a guard was bored and cruel and wanted to impress his friends with his bayonet skills. The Japanese called them maruta, logs, not people. Logs. Jack Comstock walked that march with his medical kit getting lighter every mile as he used up the supplies he couldn't replace. He gave away his morphine to men whose wounds were so catastrophic that the only mercy left was numbness. He gave away his sulphur powder to try to prevent infections, knowing it was futile. He gave away his water to patients who were dying anyway, because what else could he do? He was a doctor. His oath didn't stop being valid just because the world had gone insane. On the fourth day, he watched a guard beat a man to death for stealing a piece of sugarcane from a field they were passing. The man's crime: he was starving. The punishment: execution by rifle butt to the skull, over and over, until there was no longer anything recognisable as a head. How everyone wishes the war would end soon, Comstock wrote in his diary during those early days of captivity. It is so useless and futile, appearing especially so to us, as we believe there is only one possible outcome. He was writing about the war, but he could have been writing about the march, about the camps, about the entire horrifying experience that stretched ahead. 65 miles. Some men completed it in 5 days. Some took 10. Some never completed it at all. Conservative estimates put the death toll at somewhere between 5 and 10,000 men. That's 5 to 10,000 human beings who died walking from one place to another. Not in combat, not in a battle they could fight, just walking, dying on their feet. When the survivors finally reached Camp O'Donnell, they discovered that arrival was not salvation. The camp was designed to hold 10,000 prisoners. More than 50,000 arrived, American and Filipino combined. There was one water spigot for the entire camp. One. Men would wait in line for 24 hours just to fill a canteen. The latrines were open trenches that quickly became cesspools of disease. The barracks were bamboo huts that provided no protection from rain or sun, and the dying accelerated. In the first month at O'Donnell, more than 1,500 Americans died. 1,500. That's 50 men per day. In June, the death rate climbed to as high as 400 per day when you counted the Filipino prisoners. The Japanese kept meticulous records. They logged every death, every body, every number. But they didn't do anything to stop it, because to the Japanese camp administrators, this wasn't a crisis. This was working as intended. Dead prisoners required no food, no guards, no logistics. Dead prisoners were economically efficient. Dr. Comstock found himself working in what they called a hospital, a series of bamboo huts with no medicine, no equipment, no supplies. His diary entries from this period read like a descent into madness. June 27. 3 patients with cerebral malaria will likely die despite giving some of my own quinine. Very depressing situation. July 6. Depressed tonight, maybe homesick. News from home would help a lot. July 11. Announced by Japanese Imperial Headquarters that from now on, for every man who escapes, 10 prisoners will be shot. July 13. More unsubstantiated rumours of leaving. 33 deaths today. 33 deaths in one day in one camp, and all Comstock could do was write it down and try to save the next one, knowing he probably couldn't. The math was simple and brutal. The Japanese provided approximately 500 grams of rice per prisoner per day. That's about 17 ounces. The minimum caloric intake for a sedentary adult male is roughly 1,500 calories. 500 grams of rice provides about 900 calories, and that's if it's clean rice, which it wasn't. The rice was often mouldy, always infested with weevils and maggots. Men had to choose between eating nothing or eating bugs. They ate the bugs. But bugs and rice don't prevent beriberi, the vitamin deficiency disease that makes your legs swell and your heart fail. They don't prevent scurvy, which makes your gums rot and your teeth fall out. They don't prevent pellagra, which causes dementia and death. The prisoners at O'Donnell and the other camps that followed weren't just underfed. They were systematically malnourished to the point of organ failure. And yet, despite everything, men tried to survive. They shared food. They carried water for friends too sick to walk to the spigot. They told jokes, sang songs, made plans for after the war. Some kept diaries. Some drew pictures. Some made decks of cards from scraps of cardboard and played poker with pebbles for chips. Jack Comstock treated patients. Every single day, no matter how hopeless it seemed, he made his rounds. He cleaned wounds with boiled water because he had no disinfectant. He set broken bones with bamboo splints because he had no plaster. He held dying men's hands and lied to them about their chances because sometimes hope is the only medicine left. A confluence of emotions dogged Jack Comstock over a period of weeks, a historian would later write. And yet he continued, as he did throughout his imprisonment, to let hope seep in. Hope, in a place where 33 men died in a single day, where the only question was whether you'd die of disease, starvation, or execution, where the guards literally had permission to kill 10 men for everyone who tried to escape. But hope was all they had, hope that America would win the war, hope that someone would come for them, hope that their families back home knew they were still alive. Most families didn't. The Japanese didn't report prisoner rosters to the Red Cross. Parents received telegrams saying their sons were missing in action, which could mean anything from captured to dead in a ditch. Some families spent the entire war not knowing. Some found out only when a skeletal stranger showed up at their door in 1945, claiming to be their son. And some never found out because their son never came home. By late 1942, the Japanese military had a logistics problem. They'd conquered vast territories across the Pacific, the Philippines, Singapore, Java, Burma. They needed labourers to build their infrastructure, mine their resources, construct their fortifications. Slave labour, essentially, and they had thousands of prisoners who weren't doing anything except dying slowly in camps. So they devised a solution: transport the prisoners to where the work was. Transport them on cargo ships, unmarked cargo ships, ships that carried oil or ammunition or supplies, ships that, to American submarines and aircraft, looked like legitimate military targets, ships that would become known as hell ships. And if you thought the march was hell, if you thought the camps were hell, you hadn't seen anything yet. Lieutenant Robert Naumann and Private Paul Cascio were blindfolded and tied when they were loaded onto a powerboat on June 21st, 1943. They travelled only at night. Neither man knew where they were going. Cascio kept expecting execution. Every time the boat stopped, every time he heard footsteps approaching, he thought, "This is it." "I was very surprised that we were being kept alive," he later recalled. "I was beginning to believe that they were going to make an exhibition of killing us." They arrived at Rabaul on June 23rd, then began a nightmarish journey that would take Cascio through multiple ships, multiple camps, always tied, always blindfolded, except when the Japanese wanted to interrogate or beat them. At one point, he heard screaming and running and thought they were charging with bayonets. They weren't, not that time. But the constant anticipation of death was its own form of torture. Cassio's journey was individual, terrifying, but relatively small scale. What happened in December of 1944 to Dr. Jack Comstock and 1,500 other prisoners was hell at industrial scale. The ship was called Oryoku Maru. Its name means joyful crane. There would be no joy. There would be no soaring. There would only be darkness, thirst, and death. Comstock had been moved through several camps by late 1944, eventually ending up back at Bilibid prison in Manila as part of a medical detachment. He was scheduled to board the Oryoku Maru with about 500 prisoners designated as labourers. The ship would take them to Japan. What neither Comstock nor any of the other prisoners knew was that Oryoku Maru was a completely unmarked cargo vessel. No red crosses, no indication it carried prisoners of war. To any American submarine or aircraft, it was just another Japanese ship, which meant it was a target. On December 13th, 1944, approximately 1,600 American prisoners were herded into the ship's cargo holds. The holds were designed to carry perhaps 200 men comfortably. With 1,600, men couldn't sit down. They could barely stand. They certainly couldn't lie down. They stood pressed against each other in complete darkness as the hatches were sealed above them. The temperature in those holds quickly climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Some estimates put it closer to 120. In that heat, in that darkness, in that crushing press of bodies, men began to go insane within hours. They screamed for water. They clawed at the walls. Some attacked each other, fighting for space, for air, for any small advantage. The strongest stood. The weakest were trampled. The dead remained upright because there was nowhere for them to fall. They didn't respect the Americans for surrendering, a doctor would later explain, but they didn't want to kill them. They needed labourers. They wanted to keep them functional, but functional was relative. The Japanese provided no water for the first 24 hours. When they finally lowered buckets, it was barely a cup per man. Men drank their own urine. Some tried to drink blood. Some cut their wrists and tried to drink from the wounds, not to commit suicide, but to survive. On the second day, December 14th, American aircraft spotted Oryoku Maru in Subic Bay. To the pilots, it looked like a legitimate target, an unmarked cargo ship near a Japanese-held port. They attacked. The bombs and gunfire killed an estimated 300 prisoners in the holds, 300 men trapped in darkness, already half dead from thirst and heat, blown apart or machine-gunned through the ship's hull. The survivors had to stand among the bodies, the blood, the pieces of men they'd known. The Japanese ordered the surviving prisoners off the ship. Those who could still walk stumbled onto the shore at Olongapo. They were machine-gunned as they tried to swim. Some drowned. Some made it to the beach only to be shot by guards. Some were recaptured and beaten for trying to escape. Jack Comstock, somehow, survived. He survived the initial boarding. He survived the holds. He survived the American attack. He survived the swim to shore. He watched hundreds of men die and somehow didn't become one of them. But the journey wasn't over. The Japanese weren't about to let 1,500 labourers go to waste just because one ship had been destroyed. They had more ships. They had Brazil Maru. They had Enura Maru. On December 20th, the survivors, now numbering around 1,200, were loaded onto Brazil Maru. Same conditions, same overcrowded holds, same heat, same darkness, same thirst. They sailed to Takao Harbour in Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. On January 9th, 1945, while the prisoners were still in the holds, American aircraft attacked the harbour. Bombs struck Enura Maru, another hell ship the prisoners had been transferred to. More than 250 men died in that attack. The survivors were moved again, this time to Brazil Maru for the final leg to Japan. By now, the death toll from all causes, thirst, heat, disease, American attacks, execution, had reduced the original 1,600 to about 450. 3/4 of the men who'd boarded at Manila were dead, not from combat, from transport. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the norm. The Japanese transported approximately 50,000 Allied prisoners on what became known as hell ships throughout the war. At least 21,000 died in transit, killed by suffocation, thirst, disease, or friendly fire from Allied forces who had no idea prisoners were aboard. The Arizan Maru was torpedoed by an American submarine in October 1944. Of the 1,800 prisoners aboard, only 9 survived. The Shinyo Maru was torpedoed in September 1944. 668 prisoners died. 82 survived. The Junyo Maru was torpedoed in September 1944. 5,620 people died, Allied prisoners and Javanese labourers. It remains one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. You've probably never heard of it. Why? Because these ships were unmarked. Because the Japanese refused to follow Geneva Convention protocols about identifying prisoner transports. Because they packed men into holds like cargo and sailed them through war zones where every ship was a target. And because when those ships went down, there were rarely survivors to tell the story. Stephen Oberle, a doctor who later specialised in treating former POWs, called Oryoku Maru one of the most famous hell ships in existence. Famous among survivors and historians, perhaps. But ask the average American about hell ships, and you'll get a blank stare. We remember the Bataan Death March. Barely. We remember the fall of Corregidor. We might remember that there were POWs in the Pacific, but the hell ships, the floating coffins where men were literally boiled alive in the holds, where they went insane from thirst and tore each other apart, where more Americans died per ship than died at Pearl Harbor. That we forgot, or maybe we never wanted to know in the first place. When Jack Comstock finally arrived in Japan in February of 1945, he'd lost 40 pounds from his already lean frame. His malaria attacks, which had started in the Philippines, were now constant. Every few days the fever would come, the chills would rack his body, and he'd shake so violently he couldn't hold a cup of water. But he was alive. And as long as he was alive, there were patients to treat. He was sent to a camp called Afuna, about 7 miles outside Yokohama. It was designated as a punishment camp, reserved for airmen and naval personnel, men the Japanese considered especially troublesome. The treatment was correspondingly harsh. Paul Cascio, the young soldier who'd survived the Bataan Death March, ended up at Afuna as well, after his own nightmarish journey through multiple camps and interrogations. Here there were quite a few American prisoners, he later recalled. All prisoners here were flyers and Navy personnel, captured by the Japanese Navy. At Afuna, the pretense of following any kind of civilized convention evaporated entirely. The guards beat prisoners for sport, for mistakes, for no reason at all. Men were locked in solitary confinement cells so small they couldn't stand or lie down, forced to remain in a crouch for days. Food was reduced as punishment. Medical care was non-existent. And yet, even here, Comstock set up what passed for a medical practice. Without instruments, without medicine, without even basic sanitation, he tried to keep men alive. His diary entries became increasingly sparse. Keeping a diary was forbidden, and the risk of being caught grew too great. But what entries survive paint a picture of systematic cruelty. My malaria attacks were frequent now. In the beginning, I was given 2 pills and a powder 3 times a day. That was the extent of his medical care. 3 pills a day, for malaria, for a doctor treating hundreds of sick men. But at least he was getting treatment. Most prisoners received nothing. They simply died. The work the prisoners were forced to do depended on which camp they were in. Some worked in mines, digging coal or copper 14 hours a day, with minimal equipment and maximal danger. Cave-ins were common. Safety was non-existent. If you were injured and couldn't work, you didn't eat. Some worked in shipyards, building the very vessels that would carry more prisoners to their deaths. Some worked in factories, manufacturing steel or chemicals or weapons. Some worked on railroads, the infamous Burma Railway, built by Allied POWs and Asian labourers, killed roughly 13,000 prisoners and 80,000 labourers. That's one death for every sleeper laid on the track. The Japanese called it construction, history calls it slavery, and through it all the diseases kept killing. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, pellagra, tuberculosis, pneumonia, cholera. If it could kill a man, it was present in the camps. Without proper nutrition, the prisoners' immune systems couldn't fight off infections. A minor cut could become septic. A case of diarrhea could be fatal dehydration within days. The Japanese military doctors assigned to the camps, and there were doctors, which makes it worse somehow, kept detailed medical records. They documented the diseases. They recorded the deaths. They performed autopsies. They knew exactly what was killing these men. They did nothing to stop it. Why? Because in the Japanese military philosophy of the time, prisoners had no value beyond their labour. Feed them enough to work them until they can't. When they die, replace them with the next batch. It was a calculus of cruelty that treated human beings as expendable resources. But here's what the Japanese miscalculated. They underestimated the human capacity for resistance. The prisoners organised. In camps across the Pacific, despite the threat of execution for any form of resistance, they found ways to fight back. They sabotaged production, making defective bullets, weakening structural supports in buildings, accidentally damaging equipment. They stole food and medicine and shared it with those who needed it most. They maintained military structure and discipline, holding secret formations, conducting covert training, preparing for the day they might be liberated or might have a chance to escape. Some did escape. The numbers were small. The Japanese policy of executing 10 prisoners for everyone who escaped was an effective deterrent. But some still tried, and some succeeded. In the camps where prisoners had access to other prisoners, where American, British, Australian and Dutch men were held together, they formed what amounted to underground governments. Senior officers maintained command structures. They settled disputes, distributed resources, maintained morale. They held church services in secret, celebrated holidays with whatever meagre materials they could scavenge, maintained the fiction that they were still soldiers in an army that hadn't forgotten them. The truth was more complicated. America hadn't forgotten them, exactly, but rescuing them was nearly impossible. The camps were deep in Japanese-held territory. Any rescue attempt would require massive military operations that might kill more prisoners than they saved. And the American military had a war to win, a war that, they believed, would end the suffering of the prisoners by defeating Japan entirely. So the prisoners waited, and died, and waited some more. By 1945, the death toll was staggering. Of the roughly 140,000 American and Filipino prisoners taken at Bataan and Corregidor, more than 40,000 were dead. The Japanese had also captured British, Australian and Dutch forces in Singapore, Java and other locations, adding another 130,000 prisoners to the Pacific camps. The total Allied death toll approached 60,000. 60,000 men. 60,000 sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. 60,000 human beings who died not in combat, not with weapons in their hands, but slowly, miserably, forgotten in camps that the world didn't know existed. Jack Comstock kept treating patients. Every day, despite his own failing health, despite having no supplies, despite the absolute futility of it, he made his rounds. He cleaned wounds with whatever clean water he could find. He fashioned splints from bamboo and strips of cloth. He held dying men and lied about their chances and wrote their final words in his diary so someone, someday, might tell their families. I can persuade them to talk by being forthright about my own decades-long battle, Norman Bussell, another POW, would later say about counselling Vietnam veterans. I tell them how I avoid elevators, crowds and July 4th fireworks. I tell them that Survivor's guilt is still my strongest stressor. Bussell spent a year in German POW camps where the death rate was 1%. 1%. He still carried trauma for 70 years. Imagine what 3 years at 40% does to a man's soul. Imagine watching 3 out of every 10 men you know die. Not quickly, not in battle, slowly, from hunger, from disease, from despair. Imagine being helpless to stop it. Imagine being one of the survivors and having to ask yourself, every day for the rest of your life, why me? Why did I survive when they didn't? That's what the American POWs in the Pacific carried home with them. That's the weight that settled on their shoulders and never lifted. But in 1945, in those camps, they didn't know they'd survive. They didn't know liberation was coming. They only knew that today, right now, they were still alive. And that had to be enough. On August 6, 1945, something changed in the camps, though the prisoners didn't immediately understand what. The guards seemed different, nervous, angry, sometimes afraid. Rumours spread through the barracks that something big had happened, but no one knew what. The Japanese weren't talking, they were simply watching, waiting. 3 days later, it happened again, whatever it was. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio speakers throughout Japan, announcing surrender. The war was over. Japan had lost. In the camps, the prisoners didn't believe it at first. It had to be a trick, a test. Say the wrong thing, show too much happiness, and you'd be executed. So they waited, watched, tried not to hope too much. Then the guards started leaving, just walking away, abandoning their posts. In some camps, senior Japanese officers came to the prisoner barracks and formally surrendered their swords to the ranking Allied officer, tears streaming down their faces at the dishonour. In other camps, the guards simply disappeared overnight, leaving the prisoners in control of their own confinement. Jack Comstock was at a labour camp when liberation came. His diary entry is maddeningly brief. War over, Americans will come. That's it. After 3.5 years of hell, after watching thousands die, after surviving multiple hell ships and camps and diseases that should have killed him, all he wrote was, Americans will come. They did come. Within days, American aircraft were dropping supplies by parachute, food, medicine, clothing. The prisoners, many of whom weighed less than 90 pounds, rushed out to collect the supplies. Some gorged themselves on rich American rations and died because their bodies couldn't handle it. Starvation had shrunk their stomachs. Real food, meat, chocolate, butter, was too much, too fast. They literally ate themselves to death on the cusp of freedom. The Americans who arrived to process the liberated prisoners were shocked by what they found. These weren't soldiers. They were skeletons wearing uniforms, walking corpses. Men who'd weighed 180 pounds in 1942 now weighed 90. Some weighed less. Dr. Stephen Oberler, who would later spend decades treating former POWs, described the medical conditions. They were malnourished, they suffered from dysentery, most were traumatised by the experiences leading up to their captivity. And that was the relatively healthy ones, the ones who'd survived long enough to be liberated. The statistics were damning. Of approximately 27,000 American prisoners held by the Japanese, fewer than 18,000 survived to liberation. That's a death rate of approximately 40%. Some camps were worse. The work camps on the Burma Railway had death rates exceeding 50%. Compare that to the European theatre of 93,941 Americans held in German POW camps. Approximately 1,000 died. A death rate of 1.1%, 40% versus 1%. Let that sink in. American soldiers were 37 times more likely to die in Japanese captivity than in German captivity. Why? Why was the Pacific Theater so much more deadly for prisoners? The explanations are complex, rooted in cultural differences, military doctrine, and deliberate policy choices. The Japanese military's Bushido Code viewed surrender as dishonourable. Prisoners weren't considered worthy of humane treatment. The Japanese hadn't signed the Geneva Convention. They didn't feel bound by its rules. But it was more than that. It was systematic. It was intentional. The Japanese military command knew what was happening in the camps. They received reports. They saw the death tolls. They chose to do nothing because, from their perspective, the prisoners were already dead the moment they surrendered. Their actual physical death was just a formality. After the war ended, the question of justice arose. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, equivalent to the Nuremberg trials in Europe, prosecuted Japanese military and political leaders for war crimes. Several were convicted specifically for the treatment of POWs. 7 were executed, including General Masaharu Homma, who commanded forces during the Bataan Death March, and General Tomoyuki Yamashita, under whose command numerous atrocities occurred. But for the survivors, legal justice felt hollow. Hanging a few generals didn't bring back the dead. It didn't erase the memories. It didn't stop the nightmares. Norman Bussell, who had been shot down over Berlin and spent a year in German camps, later described his struggle. "I went through alcoholism, a broken marriage, claustrophobia, and a constant struggle with nightmares." He avoided elevators, crowds, fireworks. 60 years later, at age 91, he was still volunteering at VA hospitals, counselling veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, because he understood what they were going through in a way most civilians never could. If that was the aftermath for someone who survived relatively humane German captivity, imagine the psychological devastation for survivors of the Pacific camps. Studies conducted in the decades after the war found staggering rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among Pacific Theater POWs. 40 years after the war, 25% still reported being actively bothered by anxiety, irritability, depression, exaggerated startle response, body tremors, insomnia, and nightmares. 3 out of 4 reported intermittent problems with these symptoms. Only 4% said they'd never been troubled emotionally by their experiences. In 2018, more than 70 years after the war, researchers found that 30% of British POWs had developed what they called stalag mentality. Intense guilt at having been captured, depression, belief that their health had been permanently damaged, and severe anxiety about reintegration into society. The trauma was literally lifelong. Men who'd been 20 years old in 1942 were 96 years old in 2018. Their entire adult lives, marriages, careers, children, grandchildren, all lived in the shadow of what they'd endured in those camps. And yet, most Americans don't know about it. We know about D-Day. We know about the Battle of the Bulge. We've seen Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers. The European theatre dominates our cultural memory of World War II. The Pacific Theatre, we know about Pearl Harbor. Maybe we know about Iwo Jima or Guadalcanal. But the POWs, the hell ships, the systematic starvation and abuse of American servicemen, that story got buried. Why? Partly because the survivors didn't talk about it. The psychological trauma was so severe that many men simply couldn't discuss what they'd experienced. For those of us who recognised that we had a problem, Bussell wrote, a trip to a VA hospital for help quickly convinced us that they didn't have a clue as to what was wrong with us. So we went back to our jobs and self-medicated with alcohol at night and on weekends. The VA wasn't equipped to handle the scale of psychological trauma coming back from the Pacific. They barely understood PTSD. It wouldn't be officially recognised as a diagnosis until after the Vietnam War. So the men suffered in silence, self-medicating with alcohol, avoiding situations that triggered memories, trying to be normal when normal had become impossible. Partly too, the story got buried because America wanted to move on. The war was won. Japan was occupied, then rebuilt as an ally. There was a Cold War to fight. The past needed to be passed, but mostly it got buried because acknowledging what happened meant acknowledging what we'd done wrong. American submarines sank hell ships not knowing prisoners were aboard. American aircraft bombed POW camps marked with POW on the roofs because intelligence hadn't reached the pilots. American military command had left 76,000 men on Bataan with insufficient supplies, insufficient support, and insufficient planning for evacuation or rescue. MacArthur did return to the Philippines, but for 27,000 American prisoners, he returned too late. Jack Comstock survived the war. He came home to Boulder, Colorado, married, had a family, lived until 1996. He rarely spoke about his experiences. His diary entries, meticulous records of dates and events and death tolls, remained private until after his death, when researchers discovered them and realised their historical value. Paul Cascio came home to his family, became a brick mason, raised children, lived until 2006. His story only became public when his nephew submitted it to the American Legion's Oral History Project. Norman Bussell lived to be 91, spending his final years counselling younger veterans, finally able to turn his trauma into purpose. Most of the others, the ones who survived, lived quiet lives. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't give interviews. They went back to their towns, their jobs, their families, and they tried to forget. But they couldn't forget. A study of former POWs found that not a day passes that I do not in some way recall some portion of the past, as one anonymous veteran put it. Not a day, for 70 years. The men who died, the 27,000 who never came home, they don't even get that mercy. Their names on a wall, numbers in a report, footnotes in history books that focus on battles and generals and strategic decisions. This documentary is their memorial. These words are their testimony. Because they can't speak for themselves anymore. 40% versus 1%. 27,000 dead. Hell ships, where men boiled in holds too hot for human survival. Camps where malnutrition and disease were policy. Guards who beat prisoners to death for entertainment. That happened. To Americans. To your fathers and grandfathers and uncles and neighbours. And we forgot. Or we never learned in the first place. Now you know. Now you can't unknow. Now when someone asks you about World War II prisoners of war, you won't just think about the Great Escape and neat German stalags where the biggest problem was boredom. You'll think about Jack Comstock, the young doctor who gave away his morphine and his water and his hope but somehow kept treating patients anyway. You'll think about Paul Cascio, blindfolded and tied, expecting execution every moment, surviving anyway. You'll think about the 1,600 men in the holds of Oryoku Maru, dying of thirst while floating on an ocean made of water they couldn't drink. You'll think about the 27,000 who didn't make it home. And maybe, just maybe, you'll tell someone else their story. Because the dead can't speak. But we can speak for them. We owe them that much.